All right, Dr. Gregory Shushan, welcome to Grimerica. We are excited to have you here to talk about your upcoming book and your like decades worth of research.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, this will be a blast. I mean, I'm just thinking I've got so many questions already, but I mean, maybe just a quick background or like, and maybe also like how you feel NDE research and how that's come because it's changed quite a bit. I mean, you've been into this for 25 years, and I think we've seen a pretty big shift in acceptance to this phenomenon.
Yeah, I think, well, it's a tricky question because I'm actually don't really consider myself like an NDE researcher. I'm a historian of religions who happen to like look at NDEs across cultures and throughout history. So I'm kind of coming at it from a very different angle than people like Raymond Moody or Kenneth Ring or Bruce Grayson. Um, but yeah, so from my perspective, the way the field hasn't changed is it hasn't started integrating cross-cultural and historical evidence very much. And that's where I kind of think that my work presents partly as something of a challenge to whatever paradigm you subscribe to, whether you think NDEs are real metaphysical experiences or if you think they're all in the brain. The cross-cultural stuff really needs to be taken into account, and it really isn't in most studies.
Yeah, that surprised me. I really thought that this would have been all teased apart already because,
Yeah,
yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
you would think.
but I just still blows me away that people like scientists just deny the actual reality of it. You know, there's so much, to me, there's so much evidence that points to some sort of extended consciousness thing. I feel like we've won that fight, but there's still people, I guess, hanging on to that materialistic paradigm.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't even step into that stream unless I'm really kind of um, pushed on the question, and even then, I'm pretty equivocal about the whole thing.
Really, eh?
Yeah, just because my focus is really the way that NDEs have been um, influencing afterlife beliefs and other kinds of religious beliefs really throughout history, and that's been a kind of like, for one thing, it's been ignored in the humanities. In general, it's just kind of like an undercurrent that never really has risen to the top. And even like in the study of religions, there's this attitude that all experience, not even just, paranormal type experience, but any experience is just entirely generated by culture and language.
Yeah.
So you can't even say that there's a thing called a near death experience on which people could be basing their beliefs. So
Yeah.
it's a lot of things to push back against, really.
And it's more like a death experience at the end of the day. Really, it's like you kind of died. It's not like you like almost got hit by a car. It's like I feel like it's like you're. It's more than near death. I think near death kind of under describes it.
Yeah. I think the language needs to be parsed a little bit more because in some cases it really is a temporary death experience according to how we measure death. Whereas they can also happen during deliberate kind of shamanic practices, and people can have them spontaneously when they're not even sick. People can have them when they think they're going to die, like if they're falling off a cliff, but then they land and they're not even hurt, and they didn't kind of even lose consciousness. They can still have a kind of full blown NDE on the way down. So it's a lot more complex of a experience type than I think most people realize.
So before we dig into that, I'd like to, because you mentioned you're a historian, not really a near death guy. So I'd like to just kind of tease that out a bit of how you bridge that gap. Like what sort of historian stuff were you doing when that made you think about this ND stuff? Because most of the people we talk to when it comes to near death experience, they either had a near death experience or they know somebody who had a near death experience, or they're, kind of just wacky. And then they're like set out to, maybe not wacky, I shouldn't say that, but they're like set out to research near death experiences as a research thing.
Right.
But this, to come at it from this angle, I'm just curious what that sort of looked like.
Yeah, I mean, I had known about NDEs, since I was a teenager or whatever, and just kind of seeing flatliners and just, reading Moody's book. It's all kind of in the popular imagination of culture nowadays, and it has been for, 50 years basically since Moody first wrote his Life After Life book. But my kind of, research involvement in it came. I was my first degree was in Egyptian archaeology, and this was in London at University College London. And I was reading texts about the afterlife and description of what the afterlife is like. And basically these books they're books of the dead type things. I was looking at the earlier ones like the coffin texts and pyramid texts, and they're designed to kind of help the soul navigate their way through the other world and achieve a sort of optimal afterlife. And so as I'm reading this, I'm kind of thinking, oh, it's interesting. They travel through darkness in these caves, these subterranean realms. They enter where there's a being of light who's the sun god. They meet their deceased relatives there. They're also associated with the god Osiris. Like they're told like you are Osiris basically. And at that point they encounter the corpse of Osiris in the other world. So that's seen as what I saw that as like a out of body experience symbol. So like you're encountering your own corpse, which is in the form of Osiris in the Egyptian ideology, and then recognizing that you are one and the same with this god, meaning that you're dead and yet still alive, is what allows you to kind of continue on. And that's often how it is in NDEs. People see their dead body, and that's what makes them realize, wait a minute, I'm actually dead, but my consciousness has survived. So basically, yeah, I just kind of put together these connections that made me think like, if there are all these similarities between Egyptian afterlife beliefs and NDEs, I wonder if like they could be basing their beliefs on this kind of experience, and then also like how far can I take that in different cultures around the world?
Right. And creating religion and everything. I mean, so because I was mentioning to you, like we just put out Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Tibetan Book of the Dead out on audio. So I narrated both of those, and I was thinking about NDEs constantly. I'm like, this is like from an NDE. Like and when we look at the modern stuff that we know about NDEs, like people coming back with maybe powers, like maybe special powers. Some claim to have healing powers. Some have clairsentience or audience or who knows what. And then they there's some more themes I'll talk about later, but then they claim to be sent back. Their work's not done, and then you wonder about this Egyptian stuff, and you're thinking, what about all those people that might have come back from NDEs back then and had powers, or what were they looked upon? Like, were they looked upon like demigods, or that could have created all these religions, right? The hell, the Hades, the Amenta, all this subterranean stuff. Like, isn't that could be you going back and experiencing like in Egypt, your heart is being weighed against a feather. Like it seems like it could all be connected with like NDEs and the afterlife knowledge coming from NDEs.
Right. Yeah. And that's another example. The heart being weighed by the feather is kind of like conceptually similar to a life review, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And there's even a text that says it's called the Teaching for King Merikare. And it says something like his lifetime was laid out before him in an hour, as these deities are helping him to kind of assess his past deeds. But I should also add, just to clarify, that there aren't any examples of actual NDEs from ancient Egypt, because they didn't write about stuff like that. They didn't have like personal narratives. So what we have is the ancient texts that describe the afterlife, which has similarities to NDEs. But yeah, there's not like so it's really to some degree it's a matter of interpretation.
So do you think it wasn't just named something else, or they called it something else, or like?
There's just no
there's no reference.
Yeah, I mean, writing was basically used for like religious ritual texts and for accounting and government stuff. So they're just like, and a few literary tales, stories like the story of the shipwrecked sailor where he meets a snake on an island and things like that. But for the most part, yeah, there wasn't like, Dear Diary or reporting about what was going on in the society, nothing like that. It was just really restricted use of writing. And it's partly because hardly anybody was literate.
So same with like, when does it start? When do they start writing about it? Like, do they do it in Greece and Rome, or in the classical period, or did they?
Yeah, it's later in later Egyptian period, there's a couple of stories. There's one about a magician who goes to the underworld, but it seems to be that he goes in his body, and it's very much like a moralizing sort of tale. That's kind of like the nearest you get in Egypt at all, which is kind of surprising considering how focused they were on death and the afterlife.
And the body, and like, because I thought maybe they're keeping the body so that somebody has time to come back into it, or so that they recognize it as a symbol. Like you said, they see the Osiris, so then they know, like, I have to move on now. Like, they're not getting stuck in this like half limbo type area.
Yeah, the body has to be maintained so the soul can be maintained while it's in the other world. But as far as like the first actual example of an ND, it might be, you've probably heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh from ancient Sumer, Mesopotamia. Even earlier than the Epic of Gilgamesh, there were these stories about Bilgamez, which was his Sumerian name, and it's believed that he was an actual real king. And so there's an account called The Death of Bilgamez, where he is lying there on his deathbed, and his soul goes to the other world, and he encounters beings of light in the shape of these deities who then review his life, and they help him kind of ask him things about his deeds on Earth, things that he accomplished, and then they use that information to determine what his afterlife fate is going to be. And so at that point they make him into an otherworld judge, but then at that point he goes back to Earth. Wakes up in his body, and he has to like kind of put his affairs in order, build his monuments in his tomb, and then presumably he dies later. But that's the first one that's kind of a narrative about a historic person, somebody who really lived, and contains the kind of context of a near-death experience where he dies and comes back to life, and then also contains some of those familiar features. And he also meets his relatives as well. So there's 6 or 7 very typical NDE features in that story.
Right. So what about after him? Like, what's next in line? And I saw a reference in my research. I saw a reference to Thespesius. I think Plutarch was talking about Thespesius.
Yeah. There's some in Greece. There's Plato's Myth of Ur is another really early one. Sorry, my dog's barking over there.
Okay.
Who wants to come on the show?
Yeah. There's quite a few from ancient China, from maybe 8th century BCE. So, and then a few from India, which are the ones from India are a little more clearly mythological, but they also seem to have a kind of an NDE basis, or at least knowledge of NDEs that people are kind of elaborating on these stories. But so it's at a certain point they start kind of accelerating in as far as how they're documented. And that's especially the case in China. In China, there were, dozens and dozens of accounts and whole books that have not even been translated.
Wow.
Medieval Chinese texts. So
fascinating.
Yeah. And from Greece as well, there's quite a few. And it's interesting. I was just working on the Myth of Ur, because my next book is going to be about near-death experience in ancient Greece and Rome. And the Myth of Ur seems to be the earliest one in Plato's Republic, as I mentioned. And throughout Greek and Roman history, from Plato onwards, there's this debate about whether this was a real story, whether Ur was a real person, where he came from, what the story meant, if it was just symbolic philosophy and poetry. So even then, there was a consciousness of the experience, and they were taking them seriously as a source of knowledge. And there was a debate about them, just as there is now, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
It was probably like a lot more accepted in all of those cultures that you could just you guys would just be sitting around, and it was just probably, you were able to just openly discuss it. It wasn't like this weird taboo thing that you got to, sneak around, and only certain people and some, no one was calling you crazy. I feel like in any of those cultures.
In Greece, they definitely were. Yeah.
Were they?
Greece, yeah. There was a lot of ridicule about it, and people kind of. There's one text in Lucian where the scenario is a bunch of philosophers are sitting around discussing the weird shit that people believe, and he says, so and so believes that a gigantic person came striding through the landscape. This huge giant, and somebody else believes about falling into a chasm into the underworld, and then that's what prompts them to say, well, I heard this story about somebody who died and came back to life. So basically the point was these stories of NDEs are just as crazy as all this other stuff. So yeah, there was definitely debate going on about whether they were ridiculous stories, like some people say now, or whether they were things that really happened.
Because it has changed quite a bit since the age of reason and enlightenment and all that. I mean, and we, I think we're reaching a new point now where people will talk about it again. Like people, it's opening back up. But I mean, for a couple hundred years there, well, I don't know. There was also, quite a revival with spiritualism and all that as well in the 1800s. But so I kind of flip flop back and forth too. But I think you did mention that the modern NDs are a little bit different, right? Is some of that? Could you maybe say that some of that is because of our materialistic conditioning? Because I would say that, like, Darren's right about maybe a lot of the other cultures. Like, don't a lot of the other cultures in the world believe in the afterlife anyways?
For sure, yeah. Yeah, and what Darren was saying is definitely applicable to like a lot of the Native American cultures.
You're right.
My book before this one is Near-Death Experience in Indigenous Religions, and I looked at Native American, African, and Pacific cultures and tried to look at them at like the earliest times when missionaries and explorers and like the early anthropologists were interviewing people in these societies, kind of before they were heavily influenced by Christianity or Islam or whatever. Yeah, and in those cases, in Native America and especially Polynesian cultures, there was a lot of just acceptance that, of course, these experiences happen, and also just overt statements that this is how we know about the afterlife because, so and so, this named individual who we knew a couple of years ago died and came back to life, and he told us what it was like. So we know what it's like. So it was an almost casual thing, and they use that to combat missionary teachings. And so missionaries would come and say, you need to believe in this heaven and hell afterlife, and the teachings of Jesus was this, that, and the other. And these Native Americans would be saying, well, actually, no, that was a couple thousand years ago, and why should we believe that when we know somebody who was there just recently? So, which is actually really logical when you think of it. But the missionaries, they didn't buy it.
Oh, I love that. That's awesome.
Yeah, so it's used as like a political pushback, really, against the colonizers.
Does the belief in it change the experience?
That's a tricky question, actually, because I think it probably does. But atheists will have NDEs. People who have no even inkling of a belief in an afterlife will still have an NDE. But they tend to maybe see like a generic being of light rather than Jesus or Krishna or the Buddha or whatever. But they definitely do differ as far as going back to your earlier question that, for example, the life review I mentioned earlier, the kind of popular idea that we have of a life review of like your whole life playing before your eyes in a flash. And then a lot of contemporary NDEers say that they also felt everything that they had inflicted on other people. So if they were mean to someone, they felt that person's distress and sorrow or whatever. That's pretty much absent across cultures. What there is a kind of a much broader notion of like accounting for your life or some kind of evaluation of what your life was like and the deeds that you did or whatever role you had in the community. Sometimes it's even like, did you perform the correct rituals?
Wow.
Did you perform the rituals correctly? Like in India, this is a big thing. If you didn't perform the rituals correctly, then, if you didn't burn the weeds properly or whatever, the herbs, then they'll start strangling you in the afterlife, this kind of thing. So, so that's one difference. Another one is that I find really interesting is the idea of a tunnel. So like we have this, again, popular idea almost universally, everyone will think of the light at the end of the tunnel in a near-death experience, but cross-culturally, that's really not the case. There's a lot of examples, especially in ones from the Pacific and Native Americans, where they describe that they walked along a road to the other world, and they'll say like, I could see the footprints in the sand of all the other souls who had walked to the other world before me. And then sometimes they'll see somebody else who's having a near-death experience on their way back, like they're walking to the other world and somebody else is walking back on this path back to their body. So yeah, no tunnel, but the concept of getting from this world to another world, this kind of means of transportation is the same. It's just not often a tunnel.
Wow. Darren, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind. Can you, because I I'd like to hear some more about the myth of what was one from the, because I'm curious to unpack like the more into this, the myth from the Greek guys there, that the ones
The
that
myth of Ur. Yeah.
aren't into it.
Yeah, the myth of Ur is so basically it's follows a discussion about basically criticizing poetry and imaginative texts and things like this, and then it's a discussion about the survival of the soul after death and the nature of the soul, and it's between Socrates and Plato's brother, supposedly, but it's written by Plato, but it's sort of presented as like he's quoting what Socrates told him. So then Socrates tells the brother, I'm going to tell you this account of what happened to this guy, and it's not going to be like the story of Odysseus going to the other world, which is from Homer, and I take that as him meaning this is going to be true. It's not going to be like that myth. So then he says there was this soldier and his name was Ur, and he gives the name of his father, and he tells us where he's from. And then he describes how he was found dead on a battlefield and he was taken back to his home. And he gives like these little details, and those details are what make me feel like it's maybe based on an actual experience. So he also says that his, unlike the other bodies on the battlefield, his body hadn't started to decompose and there was still a little bit of warmth in it. So that's also a kind of, I think, indication of like, he's presenting this as something true.
Yeah.
But then, so he leaves this body and he comes back to life and he tells this story of the other world. And some of it is familiar from what we know about NDEs, but a lot of it is just like Plato riffing on his philosophy of the soul and the cosmos and life after death. And he describes like the workings of the universe, which he calls the spindle of necessity. It's like this giant mechanism that's turning the cosmos in the sky, and with a huge beam of light through it. I mean, it's really kind of pretty trippy sort of stuff, and very much like any NDE that we know. And then he starts talking about the three fates, which are ancient Greek figures. And then he meets Odysseus himself in the other world. He meets and he's talking about how each of these people from Greek history and mythology are choosing their new incarnation, who they're going to be reborn as. And he meets Orpheus and all these other kind of legendary mythological figures. So it's really this combination of mythological and NDE elements, I think.
Yeah. Huh.
So,
are there any parallels we can draw between those, like between the old ones and the new ones?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just the basics of, having the basic context of that it's somebody is said to be dead. He leaves his body, he sees the light, and he meets deceased relatives and comes back to the body. And he was also sent back with a particular mission that he's supposed to like tell his people about the afterlife, and that there is no death, and they're gonna transcend this body in the other world, basically, which is a really common thing in modern NDEs.
Wow.
So I think the way to look at it is like, if you look at it thematically, like the themes are pretty much the same everywhere, but the specifics of those of the way they're expressed is really in cultural and individual symbolic terms.
Crazy.
I feel like this is important work. I feel like we need as a people to believe in it, not be so nihilistic that this is the end, that there is something afterwards. Do you has your beliefs changed while doing all this research at all?
No, not really. I really try to not let my beliefs impact the research at all.
Right.
So I've kind of, I mean, obviously I think about it in serious metaphysical terms.
Yeah.
And I've written about it a little bit, but I really try to just like not put a foot on either side of the argument and just steer the middle path, because in a way it's irrelevant to what I'm saying and what I'm arguing. But I do think it has a serious impact on near-death studies, or it should, because basically every book about NDEs any theorizing that's done is based entirely on like this Western hypothetical model that goes way back to Raymond Moody.
Yeah.
And nobody says like, okay, another example of a difference is, you know, in the West, contemporary NDEs that we're familiar with, people are sent back to their body because, you know, they have to spread the news, or they have to take care of somebody, they have to look after their kids, or there's always some kind of like almost personal development kind of reason. But in a lot of other societies, like there's some ancient Chinese accounts and some from India, it's a case of mistaken identity, the reason that they're sent back. So the being of light or the relative or whatever, they're not saying like, you need to go back and fulfill this, it's not your time to die. They're basically saying, we got the wrong Gregory Shushan and we have to go get the one who lives in upstate New York. So you go back to your body, and then the other person with my name is then going to die permanently. So, you know, and contemporary near-death studies, I've never seen any, you know, scientific or popular work on NDEs that takes those diversities and differences into account. And I think they need to, because it's supposed to be a universal human phenomenon, and they're basing it on this stereotypical Western model.
Right. Yeah. So I guess I'll throw out the research that I did and at you and see what you think about it. I'm really interested to hear your opinion on it. And what I found was a sort of a pattern that was happening. I was reading these books on ancient wisdom. So like, you know, let's say like Theosophy, Manly P. Hall, so magic and mythology and all this kind of stuff. And I was noticing this pattern of 3 days. So 3 days came up, but it came up in terms of what really connected it to me was the resurrection and initiation.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started compiling all these texts that I had that were referencing 3 days, I mean, it was unbelievable. Like there were so many of them.
Yeah.
And they were talking about, to me, NDE kind of fits in with it. It kind of fits in with it because there was, I found a bunch of NDE accounts going back, like not any ones probably that you haven't seen or whatever, but just ones that I referenced in my books. And there was so many of them that were about 3 days. Right.
Yeah.
And they had, and then they had the resurrection at 3 days and the initiation at 3 days. So it seemed to me like to get initiated, it seemed to me like they were trying to manifest a resurrection type transformation through a 3-day initiation, like almost copying an NDE. And the weird thing was that happened is, and what put it all together for me is we had a guy on named Vinnie Tolman who had a modern NDE. I don't know if you ever heard of his account.
No.
And he says, and after 3 days, I woke up out of the coma, and then I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what I've been reading in these old ones, right?
Yeah.
And I was putting the 3 days at, the main reason it was 3 days was a lunar or a solar kind of symbolism from that. You know, in December when the sun sort of stops and it starts heading back, stops for 3 days, the new moons kind of goes black for 3 days. Like,
yeah.
So, but anyways, I'm trying to find a decent question in here, but I guess, is there anything to maybe what I'm thinking about the resurrection and the initiation, and did you notice 3 days in all this? Because I was seeing the NDEs, which to me almost could be like a resurrection,
for sure,
death, right? Like maybe they were calling it resurrection instead of near-death experience.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I should say that's been one of the huge challenges of my research is there was no term for near-death experience, you know, before Raymond Moody. So when I'm looking at a 19th century ethnography, I have to just basically read everything that it says about their religion and afterlife beliefs. And somewhere I might run across, you know, an example of somebody who died and came back to life. But yeah, as far as the 3 days thing goes, that's true. I have run across it a lot in a lot of NDE accounts cross-culturally. And I read I can't remember what it was, but it was an anthropological work from, you know, earlier days, 50s or 60s, I think. And they were saying, not from the point of NDEs or anything, but they were saying basically that the reason that's a kind of recurring trope in myths and stories like this is because that's how many days until the body starts to decompose.
Right.
In a lot of environments. So it would then be stretching credibility if they were to say he was dead for 10 days. You know? Oh,
that's interesting. Yeah, I did not come across that, but I kind of did because there was an ad in one of the books I read for a cremator, and he was talking about how the occultists wait for 3 days because at that point, like there's a chance that the soul can come back into the body.
Right.
And then they
Yeah.
cremate it. So there's a technical reason why they wait 3 days, but I don't think it was about decomposing, but that kind of fits. That fits with that. And then
Yeah.
there was also like, there's also the spiritual battles that are happening. They say that there's there's all these angels versus other entities happening during this 3 days as well or something.
Yeah. And then it's kind of on the opposite of what I said about the myth of Ur, where the intention, I think, of Plato was to show that it was a true story by saying he wasn't decomposing like the other ones, because I think it
Right.
would be too outlandish for people to accept that. But then on the other side of that coin, there's some from different parts of the world. I know there's some from, I think one from Hawaii, different ones in Polynesia, where they make a point of saying the corpse had already started to decompose and he came back to life.
Wow.
The intention of that is basically to say, this is how blown away you should be by this story. Basically,
Wow.
like, this is an extreme miracle. And so there's a way of like enhancing the miraculous nature of what they're saying, rather than, anchoring it in something that's true. Even though
because there's modern examples where it's quite a ways, right? People come out of comas or whatever after, like, we're keeping people on life support, whereas I guess they wouldn't have back then.
Yeah. There's a really gruesome account
buried
from.
him.
Was that?
They would have just buried him, and they just wake up in a coffin.
Yeah, and sometimes in some societies in Africa and Micronesia, there was like a fear of the dead returning to life.
Oh, that's what I wanted to ask you about. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so they would bind their hands and feet or tie their arms and legs together, and then pile stones on the grave and like basically do everything to ensure that person's not going to come back. So
wow.
If they were going to have an NDE, they're not going to now. So
wow.
Yeah.
Well, because I was going to ask you about the opposite to that, because what I also started coming across was there was a lot of people that were sort of popping out of their graves, or they were like, they would sit up right before they're getting buried, or and it seemed to me like there was a fear of being buried alive too with people. And this might've been more of like in the 17th, 18th centuries, or maybe even 19th century. And they even made they even made special burial chambers with like a wheel that you could actually like get out of if you woke up in there.
Yeah, and some Victorian coffins have a bell in it that you can ring to alert people. Yeah, it's interesting. But it's also interesting that there's so few, like from Victorian and Edwardian psychical research in the UK and here actually. There's almost no focus at all on near-death experiences. It's all about evidential mediumship. And I don't know if that ties in with just being too freaked out about the idea of resurrection and premature burial, or if it's just that they thought that mediumship was going to give them better evidence. But it's a pretty interesting lack of,
Yeah, that is, because I would think that the NDE would also bring back evidence. I mean, we've seen read accounts where people have seen things and done things that couldn't be, accounted for physically.
Yeah, for sure.
Huh. Wow, that's fascinating.
I mean, Frederick Myers, he mentions them in some of the early Society for Psychical Research literature, but it's just like a brief mention, and then he moves on. So.
What about like zombies? Is that what the Africans were getting at? Like, so that was not like a good NDE that where they like was just like, holy shit, Bob's alive, and they freaked out, or was it like Bob came back and he was a zombie?
Basically that it's not even Bob anymore, that his body has been taken over by an evil spirit, or it's been reanimated by a sorcerer, and so it's not even that person, it's just a walking corpse, and it's going to wreak havoc on the community unless we stop it from happening. And there's even a few accounts where it's said people were stoned to death after they came back to life because they were just terrified that and it wasn't that they speculated that was what was going on. They just assumed that's what happens if you see a walking dead person, they're possessed. And this even kind of I think it was a 2006 or maybe 1996, one date like that. There's a scholar named James McLennan, who's a sociologist, and he did a study in the Congo about near-death experiences. And one family he was talking to, they had a near-death experience in the family, and this was like, you know, a Christianized modern family. And when that person came back to life, they all fled because they were terrified that it was, you know, a reanimated corpse.
Right.
And it took a while for the person to explain, like, no, it's actually really me. And then they were happy and welcomed him back into the family. But, you know, some of this stuff runs deep, just like, you know, Catholic guilt or whatever.
Right.
These kind of get reignited throughout the generations.
So what do you think about the initiations then being 3 days, and if the resurrection is 3 days, like, and I mean, it's officially kind of, the mythology of it is officially 3 days. I don't know why, but you know, do you think the resurrection could be an NDE, and do you think that that's why they made, like, why they would have tried to make initiations like that? Like they would, you know, send you to the dark sort of cellar, scare the shit out of you for 3 days with no food or, you know, sleep or whatever, and then you would come out basically like a new man.
Yeah, that's actually a parallel too that I'm writing about with Greece and Rome. That you know, the ancient mystery cults. Basically, you know, when you go through that initiation process, you come out on the other end qualified to have a better afterlife, and you've kind of, you know, you're going to die consciously, like in Tibetan Book of the Dead, maybe. But it transforms your whole future afterlife experience. And that involves going down into the darkness of the cave. You're probably drugged as well, and disoriented, and you're kind of primed to have this transformational mystical experience. And then at some point, according to some of the texts, there's a bright light and like a revelation of a deity in the darkness, again, which is, you know, very similar to an NDE.
Yeah.
And I think, and other scholars have said this before me, actually, that this very likely could be like a reenactment of an NDE, basically.
Okay, yeah. So that is interesting.
Yeah, I started calling it like the something like the shamanic replication hypothesis.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Even though it's not maybe technically shamanism, it's a similar type of thing, and it's also reflected in like Native American ghost dance tradition.
Okay.
The Indian Shaker Church. They basically modeled these religious practices on the NDE of a prophet who founded the cult or the tradition.
Well, I mean, the big one is probably Jesus, right?
Yeah, and that's you asked if the resurrection was an NDE. That's really interesting because almost like what I was saying about the Egyptians, this whole religion is based on the resurrection of this one man, basically, and you need faith in that resurrection to be, you know, a proper Christian. But what happened while he was dead, and between the time he died and came back to life? And there are like a couple of hints in the New Testament. They call it the harrowing of hell, where he goes to the underworld and frees the souls of sinners. But it's in the Gospel of Nicodemus is like where the fuller version of this happens. And that's considered like an apocryphal text. It was deleted from the official version of the Bible. And I wonder if that's because when they started, you know, codifying the Bible and deciding like what really is the Bible and what we're going to delete from it, they were maybe more concerned with the teaching that like everyone has to go through Jesus to be saved and to have a positive afterlife experience. If you don't accept Jesus, you're going to go to hell, because NDEs suggest that you go right to the deity yourself. You don't need an intermediary. So that's why I wonder if maybe Christianity would have been more of an NDE-based religion if it hadn't been tweaked at a certain point.
Right. I find that fascinating. Or they need to control it, or you know, bring it through the church to control the thing, because otherwise, if it was open to just people like experimenting on their own, you know, because especially if people do have special powers when they come back. I mean, I've heard enough examples myself where I kind of believe it. I'm like, well, seems to be happening. I mean, I talked to people for hours that have come back with like crazy premonitory abilities or all kinds of stuff. So, you know, they would know that back then, I would think, you know, the church, the mystics, they would know that like we have to be careful about too many people knowing about this. I mean, that might be one of the reasons why they kept it in the mystery schools as well, some of these things, because they don't want people just experimenting on their own and coming back with all these powers.
Yeah, that's a good point. And they could also create a rival to Jesus, basically. If there's a new prophet coming along, people might start following him instead. and donating less money to the church and what have you. And they were actually proved correct in that, because then later on you get the Mormons. And, part of Mormon teaching is that direct revelation can still happen today. And therefore Mormons embrace NDEs. NDEs are kind of integrated into their beliefs, which
Wow.
is pretty unique in Christianity.
What did you call it? Direct revelation?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Yeah. So they don't want it they don't buy the idea that all this supernatural revelation stuff happened only back in biblical times. They're saying, because they need it to be the case, because their founders were from the 19th century having these kinds of experiences. So they need to kind of bring that to the fore, basically.
And in a lot of ways that fits. I mean, it fits more than, people are having these experiences all the time. I mean, the modern NDE research, I mean, the database I went through was unbelievable how many people are reporting this stuff, and how many modern examples I found of 3 days as well.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, go to the NDERF website and it's overwhelming. And then, when I started, I was originally thinking, I'm going to find a few cross-cultural examples, and there were a few studies before I started this work. There's one by Jenny Wade, and she found, I think, 5 Native American examples, and I kind of thought, like, that's probably all there is out there. But the more I dug, and I found like 70 Native American examples. So considering that I was looking just at these anthropological and missionary and explorer texts, that's quite a lot. Considering how many there are in contemporary society, but still it's hardly anything. And I think if we had more complete records from earlier times, then we would find that people were having NDEs more commonly than we realize. Although medical resuscitation has really improved nowadays, so I'm sure a lot more have them now than in the past.
Yeah.
How big of a role did psychedelics play in some of that, in some of these cultures? Was like, because you can see some of these cultures are using that to do maybe a metaphorical NDE, and metaphorical resurrection sort of thing as well, and powerful doses of psychedelics are very much like they call it an ego death and things like that. So, but did you find a lot of any of that, or to the coinciding of the two throughout any of the research?
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, like, I mean, the ghost dance, I don't know specifically that they took any drugs, but Indian Shaker Church, I think, does peyote. I'm not sure, but definitely in a lot of, there's a few African examples of taking this drug called ibogaine, which was named after the deity Iboga. And they would take massive quantities to the point that, for all intents and purposes, they were pretty much dead and having an NDE. So yeah, the drugs definitely play a part. I think they supplement it though, rather than cause it, because you take the drug planning on having this experience, and then you have these rituals that kind of cement it. And so it's kind of steering the trip in a way. And then some examples of, physically bringing it about without drugs. Like one of them told an anthropologist that they traveled to the other world by being clubbed to death. We club each other to death. And obviously death was, metaphorical, or at least, a different meaning, because they would come back to life, but, clubbed insensible with the plan of
they
having
should try choking. It's a little more controllable, you'd think.
Yeah, they probably did that too. I mean, there's others where they would cut off their circulation with, tying it off. So yeah, there's definitely like physical deprivations that are deliberately induced to try to bring about near-death like experiences, and sometimes in order to like go after the soul of somebody who's having an NDE, somebody who's dying, and the belief is they can go to the other world and chase the soul down and bring it back to the body.
There was some, before I forget to mention it, there was some physiological stuff that I was kind of coming up with that 3-day thing as well. Like there is like a weird, like if you fast for 3 days, for example, like apparently it resets your immune system, autophagy sets in. So there is like a weird 72-hour sort of health marker as well, which kind of fits strangely enough. And I mean, who knows why that, I mean, and then I started to get into like the solar well, maybe it is solar and lunar and the whole, and it's a cycle that it affects everything, you know. Maybe it affects all these other little cycles in our bodies too.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, the gut biome changes, all kinds of stuff.
After
So
3 days of being dead, I bet.
well, I mean, you're fasting while you're
well, you're dead.
surfing those other realms, you know. I mean,
You're definitely
you
fast.
definitely not getting any nutrients.
Although if your relatives are bringing offerings to your grave, then you're not fasting, because
Yeah.
those offerings are going to reach your soul in the other world.
Yeah. Aaron, do you have any questions?
Do you think we kind of talked about the similarities between the two? Do you think, because there was definitely a huge difference in how these sort of cultures just thought about death in general? Do you think that, I mean, it's kind of the same question, but maybe in a different direction. But do you think that, do you think it's sort of cheapened today, maybe in some ways with this? Because I feel like nowadays we've got a fear of death that maybe none of those cultures had. I mean, maybe you'll correct me on that one as well, but it seems like they were all maybe not eager to die, but they definitely didn't seem to be as scared of it. And how much of that do you think tends to the level of religion and spirituality that was hanging around back then? Because I mean, today there's a lot of Christians, but how many of them really believe? And even, you know, like the level of believers, it might be at an all-time high, but the amount of them that actually think that, you know, there's an afterlife or are practicing and living by those things is a lot lower. So
Yeah.
you know, it seems to be a consequence of the culture these days, but they didn't seem to have that those days, save maybe the late Romans. So I'm wondering, I don't know if there's a question there or not, but maybe you could just sort of expand on that and tell me if I'm an idiot.
No, I think it's true. People are less spiritually religious today than they used to be. I mean, you know, the things that evangelical Christians, I mean, not to single out one particular group, but you know, the things that evangelical Christians get upset about and talk about are the antithesis of the teachings of Jesus. I mean, that's almost a cliche. If you you know, were to read the teachings of Jesus to a lot of so-called Christians on the Sermon on the Mount, they would really not relate to any of it, and they would, you know, probably call Jesus all kinds of names and write him off as some, you know, woke pansy or something. But I think it's interesting, because I think there is a correlation between NDEs and not having a fear of death, and that's evident from, you know, most people who have NDEs. That's one of the most common things they say when they come back, is that they're no longer afraid to die. But to just kind of flag the diversity again, to bring up the African civil societies again, I mentioned they didn't really have this emphasis on NDEs, and a lot of people didn't have the opportunity to have NDEs because of their burial practices and everything. But they also didn't really have a fear of death. They had the fear of the walking corpses that we talked about, but they had an acceptance of death that's like far outstrips anything that we have, to the point that, like, if somebody, an older person, just like had enough, they'd go lie down in the forest and just like lie there until it was time to die, and just kind of let nature take over. And missionaries would come by and say, look, you know, we can cure you. You just need some penicillin or whatever it is. And like, oh, leave me alone. I'm going to die. And then also there were practices where they would take the body and just like throw it out to the hyenas or whatever. Like, it's just a very different kind of mindset, where they're not hung up on the same things we're hung up on. They're hung up on different things.
Yeah, yeah. Are they? Yeah, I wonder how they are.
Well, the walking corpse thing and all that.
Yeah,
so, yeah. And when I say, I'm saying present tense, but I'm kind of referring to, you know, past societies, really, because it's very different now, obviously.
Yeah, I feel like in a lot of ways that was healthier. Like, I don't think it's healthy to have this fear. I mean, it must, you know, create anxiety, and everybody's kind of scared of all these things when.
Yeah, I think so too. And there's a lot of, you know, there's the term toxic theology that people talk about, where, you live your life being afraid of the punishment that you might have after you die.
Right. Yeah. And then there's the other side of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that can't be healthy. It can't be a healthy mentality to go through life with, and then to be so afraid of dying once you actually get there. Whether that's because you're afraid of being judged and punished, or if it's just like you're afraid of oblivion or whatever it is. You're right. Just like this, living in fear all the time is not a healthy way to be in life.
What did we miss out of your book? Your book that's coming out in February is what's it called? Near-death experience in ancient civilizations?
Right. Yeah.
The origins of the world's afterlife beliefs. Oh, I love that subtitle. This is important.
Thanks. Yeah. But yeah, basically, I guess I didn't really just describe what it does. So it looks at the earliest periods of development and the earliest religious texts of these different ancient civilizations. So Egypt, ancient Sumer and Old Babylon, ancient China before Buddhism, India before Hinduism, and the Mesoamerican cultures of Aztec and Mayan. And I chose those because they were basically didn't have much cultural contact. So nobody can say like, the Mayans just believe what they believe because they got it from the Egyptians. That just didn't happen. There wasn't like this sharing of myths. So the idea was to look at their afterlife beliefs and then look at them in light of near-death experiences and see, how much they corresponded to them. But then also in most of the societies, except Egypt, as I mentioned, to also look at examples of near-death experiences, whichever ones I could find in each one, and how they wrote about them, and the kind of attitudes towards the experiences, and if there's any evidence that they really did influence their afterlife beliefs in any kind of wider way. So, and there is the spoiler.
If you could find some lost scrolls about the afterlife or spirituality in some cave somewhere, which culture would you pick? Which one do you think has the most missing, or maybe the most
revelatory,
revelatory
potential for
most potential for revelatory, whatever?
Wow, that's a tough question. Although I'd probably say Egypt, just because it's always the outlier because of their, the limited use of text I mentioned. So it'd be amazing to be able to
rule
know
out that they weren't like reincarnating themselves in some. It seems they seem to be the most obsessed with death out of all of them.
Yeah. I think that's probably fair to say, given the expense and energy and thought, and I mean, so much of their religious texts are about the afterlife. I mean, you've got from the pyramids texts all the way to the late period texts of the Amduat and these kind of things. They're basically saying and elaborating on the same things for more than 3,000 years, which is pretty amazing. But it's an interesting thing about that, though, is like the earliest texts were they were more reserved for the upper classes of society, the priests and kings, and they were mostly just carved in pyramids. And then gradually they became accessible to more people. And as that happened, it seems like the ruling elite and the priestly class started introducing more and more ideas about punishment and hell. And I think that was, a kind of controlling of the populace kind of move. And that's also mirrored in China and other places, that the more popular access to the afterlife becomes, or to afterlife wisdom becomes, the more there is this like threat of hell and promise of heaven kind of stuff.
They all seem to have their Hades, right?
Yeah. And it's manipulated, by the people in charge.
Wow, that's fascinating. And what is the gist of that you go into hell when you die? You're going to go into hell, and then you got to sort of make your way back out of it.
It depends on the culture. In a lot of the Egyptian texts, it's like annihilation is the worst thing to happen. So there's a lot of threats to being annihilated.
Would that be like being cremated?
No, I think just total non-existence was the fear, and there's even they even talk about it like in really kind of explicit terms in that way. So
wow.
Yeah, and that's also kind of mirrored in some of the ancient Indian texts. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. Whereas in China, it's more about like, if you gossiped, you're going to get a hot iron rod through your tongue. If you punched your mother, you're going to get your arm lopped off. It's like the punishment will fit the crime, and it's really, really gory detail as time goes on. So,
did you encounter any personal stories or experiences in your research that kind of like really hit home on a profound level, or shook you up, or changed your belief system in any way?
I don't know so much about that. The process has actually been the more I read different texts around the world, the more I read different NDEs, the more I'm convinced of what I've been arguing, which might sound a little arrogant, but it's kind of the case.
Good, yeah.
So, and kind of validating this idea that, people have been basing their afterlife beliefs on NDEs around the world since as long as there have been humans, which is completely rational and reasonable. And to my way of thinking, there's nothing like woo-woo about it. It's just like people have these experiences. Why wouldn't they base their beliefs on them? So
yeah.
What do you think happens when you die?
I think judging by NDEs, you're going to have this amazing experience where you feel like, you're connecting with the divine and maybe seeing your deceased relatives and having this like mind expanding universal awareness. And then after that, I don't know. It could be that like that's the last thing, and everybody has this profound magical experience at the last moment, or it could be that is the prelude to something beyond. But I think
well, the prelude to something beyond begs the question of if you're going to keep going on this research, because this sort of forks off in other stuff, right? There's the reincarnation aspect of it, and the stories of people remembering their past lives, and especially in children and stuff like that. So I'd be curious about what that looked like in ancient history.
Yeah, I've actually looked a little bit, not so much, again, kind of coming at it from a slightly different angle. Like the work of Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker and these people, very much trying to validate the accounts and trying to find historical matches to the things that the children say that will prove that they were who they remembered, identifying the personality. But to me, what was the interesting part was their intermission memories, which were basically they remember when they were that past personality. They remember their death, and they remember what would have been their NDE if they weren't reincarnated. So they will talk about, I was run over by a wagon and my soul left my body and I went and I met this divine being or whatever. So to me, that's really fascinating that children who remember past lives are describing basically what we would consider an NDE. But instead of being sent back to their old body, they're assigned to a new body. And that's when they're reincarnated. So, I found some, pretty early examples of that cross-culturally.
Before we wrap up, we'll go to the chats to Orfeo Treshula asks, but there are some claims of baneful NDEs, aren't there? Not many, but it seems there's some, which I'm assuming would be a negative experience.
Yeah, there's definitely some distressing experiences. I think it's something like 3% or whatever. But
what are they like? Is there an archetype for those? Is there like sort of a...
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, they don't seem to have the same consistency as an NDE. They don't seem to have these identifiable stages. Sometimes they do. They have like the same stages as an NDE, but the person who has the experience them in negative ways. So like the darkness will be terrifying, and rushing through the darkness is terrifying, and the being of light is threatening. So it's the same thing, but it's maybe the psychological state of the person that's coloring it. But aside from that, yeah, for the most part, like the types of negativity they experience are either kind of amorphous, like they're just, in fearful darkness for a long time, or they're not really, that identifiably similar between people.
Great. Well, I mean, Graham kind of touched on it, but before we wrap up, Gregory, is there anything you think we missed or that you'd like to touch on from the book or from your research?
Well, no, not that I can think of, except that, like, you know, just kind of touching on the negativity of belief and all that. I think the research kind of shows that if you do want to believe that near-death experiences are actual evidence for an afterlife, I think there really is nothing to be afraid of. And just kind of trusting what people who have these experiences say and what their experience is, because obviously their experience of this stuff is much greater than ours if we haven't had the experience. So I think there's a compelling argument to believe, if not in the supernatural afterlife aspect of it, to at least believe in what the death process is going to be like, that it's not really going to be that terrifying or difficult.
Yeah, that's good advice.
Yeah.
Dr. Greg Shushan, this has been great. Where can people get the book when it comes out? Where can they follow your work? Do you have any websites? Do you have social media, all that stuff? We'll put it all in the show notes, but a lot of people don't ever go to the show notes. So we just encourage the guests to give those URLs right here.
Sure. Yeah. Website is just my full name, GregoryShushan.com. I'm on pretty much all the social medias with my actual name. So Facebook,
which
X,
is 1G,
Sky.
Gregory with 1G.
Yeah. So pretty much all those, I'm easily findable, and the book should be available pretty much everywhere on any book selling website, or directly from the publisher, which is Inner Traditions. Or you can become a patron and you get free books and stuff, bonus stuff on my Patreon website.
And when's your next book coming out after this?
Oh man,
like a year or two, or?
Yeah, at least a couple of years. Yeah, I'm still doing the research. And then at some point, I'll also have a historical anthology of near-death experiences where a lot of these accounts, like just verbatim, I'm going to put together in one volume. So yeah,
that's awesome. Well, keep up the good work.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Gregory. This has been fantastic. Come back anytime.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take care.
And that was a chat with Dr. Gregory Shushan, near-death experiences in ancient civilizations. What'd you think? I knew that would end up being right up your alley.
Oh yeah, I know that was a great choice, because honestly, that's what I've been thinking while putting all this research together. I'm like, how is this not just well known? How is this not a thing? So I'm glad he's the one putting all this together.
Absolutely.
I can't believe it hasn't been like overdone already, but it's good that somebody's doing it.
So big thanks to Dr. Gregory for coming on the show. Big thanks to you guys for listening. Even bigger thanks, of course, if you're one of the few who choose to support us, keep us on the air. We are listener-supported value for value shows. So if you are getting some value from our podcast, head over to grimerica.ca/support today. Sign up for a monthly or make a one-time donation. And that'd be swell. That would be swell. I did see actually Corey Ash, who's one of our big supporters. Oh, big time supporters. We appreciate you, Corey, if you're still listening. Seen him in the chats earlier, so thank you. Thank you to everyone else who supports the show. Please do that. grimerica.ca/support. Of course, check out grimericaoutlawed.ca if you want to see all the kind of content that got us kicked out, demonetized on YouTube in the first place. Adultbrain.ca if you want to check out our 140 plus audiobooks, available also as a YouTube channel if you don't want to buy them. And contact at the cabin for the trips. We got a great one coming up with Randall Carlson, searching for Atlantis in the Azores. There's only 2 spots left for that. I mean, I've been warning you guys. Now we're there. We're going to sell out imminent. So check that out. And I'm missing one, right? Grimerica CBD. Grimerica CBD. We sell weed now, and not just weed. It's CBD. Not weed. It's CBD. So yeah, it's not weed.
Some of it is. I mean, there's some gummies.
I mean, it was inevitable we'd end up slanging drugs eventually. So you can check that out. It's not drugs, though. It's good for all your ailments. We got gummies. We got tinctures. There is some 5 milligram THC ones there if you're feeling a little swirly. So that's grimericacbd.com. And I think that's it. There's mushrooms too, but you got to check that in the show notes. I can't say that out loud on YouTube. So I'll leave it at that. We love you guys. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.